Well, hey there, welcome back. So I want to start a new series this week, and I want to probably spend 4 or 5 weeks looking at this one. And as you would have seen from the title, I've called it Are We the Corinthians? You'll understand why that is in a moment, but one of my passions, I guess, as a New Testament scholar, or something that I've probably always come back to in my research, is 1st and 2nd Corinthians. They're absolutely my favorite letters of Paul's, and probably my favorite books in the whole Bible. I'm absolutely obsessed with them. Have been for about 20 years now. In fact, going back to when I was a student, I think it's about in my 2nd year at college, I did a class on Corinthians. It was just like a 1-week intensive, and it just blew my mind. I was just absolutely hooked on this Corinthian correspondence. And that was in part, the lecturer was fantastic. He became a mentor of mine. But overall, the content and just the story of the Corinthians and the story of these 2 letters really, really grabbed me. And in part because I love ancient history. You can tell if you've listened to this show at all, you would know that that's really what a passion of mine is. I love history. I love the story behind the New Testament, hence the title of the whole show. And so what you find when you come to the Corinthian correspondence is the story of the first century. What you see through these letters is a much clearer insight into life in the first century. And so I really love that aspect about the letters. In fact, when you put the first 2 letters, when you put 1st and 2nd Corinthians next to all other ancient literature, what's so unique about Corinthians? Now, we understand the Corinthian letters as the Bible. We understand them as the Word of God, and all of that is true. But they're also historical documents. They're also first century texts written in a time and a place that's very different to our own. And so they do give us real insight into what life was like in the first century. And so what's unique about the Corinthian letters is that they give us an insight into everyday life. When you read ancient materials, ancient documents, or certainly ancient letters, they're always written by very elite men writing to other very elite men, guys like Cicero or Seneca or Pliny, these guys who are very famous letter writers. These are the absolute upper echelons of Roman society, and they're writing to their other mates. I mean, this is like the Kardashians writing to, I don't know, the Trumps or something, like people that are just living in this realm of society that none of us could even imagine. And so when we read those types of letters, we get an insight into what the 1% lived like. But for everybody else, we don't get any sense of what their life was like because, well, those people didn't write because they couldn't write. They were illiterate and they spent 7 days a week working and they had no reason to write. So we don't get much of an idea of how those guys lived. And so this is what makes the Corinthian letters so unique, is that they're written to everyday people. They're written to, everyday, middle to lower status people. And we see through the letters behaviors that are really indicative of normal everyday life of what you're going to find in that first century society. So they're really unique in that way. So for that reason, they really grabbed me early on. The history of them, the story behind them, compared to, Romans or Galatians, which are much more theological, much more, Paul working through an argument, and you don't really get a sense of the real situation of the people that he's writing to. In fact, you don't really get a sense of who they are at all. Whereas with the Corinthians, you get much more of that. And so that really grabbed me early on. And that sort of led to really a 20-year obsession with 1st and 2nd Corinthians. I did an honours after my degree and focused on Corinthians 1-4, and then I did a PhD on Corinthians 1-4, and so and since then I've been publishing and writing and teaching on Corinthians consistently through that time. So not to say that I'm anything of an expert, but I'm more familiar with the Corinthian letters than I am with really anything else in the New Testament. So it was only inevitable that I would do something like this. I would talk about the Corinthian letters at some point through this show, and I will continue to do that at various times throughout. So what I want to look at in this new series is this question of, are we Corinth? And what I want to deal with is this perception or this misperception about the Corinthians, that they are this particularly evil, immoral, disgusting, unrighteous church, so bad that Paul's basically given up on them, and certainly compared to his other really great, golden child like the Philippians. And I remember hearing this from preachers. It was always this, oh, we want to be the Philippians. We don't want to be like the Corinthians, and we never would be like the Corinthians. And they've sort of got this reputation as being basically just evil incarnate masquerading as Christians. Now, to be fair, they had their problems, and we're going to look at what some of those problems are. But where that perception comes from is this idea that Corinth itself was this particularly uniquely evil, immoral place. I mean, it was the Las Vegas mixed with the slums of big cities and brothels and red light districts, and it was just everything that was bad. I mean, if to use a Star Wars analogy, the Mos Eisley of the ancient world. I mean, it was the place where all morals go to die. So we've got this image of Corinth as being this terrible, terrible place. And the reason for that is there were early observers of the city who were just particularly biased against it. And so they sort of give this impression of what it was like. But when you look at the letters and when you sort of meet who these Corinthians were, you look at their behavior, and by certainly modern 21st century, I would say Christian standards, they're pretty bad. I mean, they're doing some stuff that's pretty out there. And, we're going to see some crazy examples today, like a man in a relationship with his stepmother. But the sort of behavior that we're seeing was absolutely standard, everyday behavior for everybody in that world. Greek, Roman, it was all the same thing. Wherever you found yourself in that world that Paul walked in, what these Corinthians are doing is standard, normal behavior, completely standard. The problem with the Corinthians is not that they were acting particularly badly, it's that they were acting like Corinthians. And as Corinthians, they were acting like people of that time. What the Christian message did over the centuries as it got a hold into this Roman world is that it began to change that. It began to change the moral framework of particularly ideas towards sexuality and towards slavery and these sorts of ideas. And over time, it sort of changed a lot of that. But when Paul was first preaching in a place like Corinth, that's just how the world was. That was the world that he was coming in to change. And that was going to take time. And so what we find with the Corinthians are a group of people who've come into this community but haven't really been changed by the message. So it hasn't grabbed them. It hasn't transformed them in the way that Paul needed it to. And there were reasons for this, and we'll go into some of those reasons over the next few weeks. But what it comes down to is that the Corinthians were just being Corinthians. They were just doing what they've always done. And the reason why Paul's having to address some of these issues is because they've arisen after Paul's come to Corinth, he's done his 18 months of ministry, and then a few years later, these issues have arisen. And you say, well, how did that come about? Why didn't Paul deal with that? Well, because when Paul was first in Corinth, these weren't issues. Right? These just weren't problems. And so over time, after Paul's left, as more people have joined the church and as the community's growing, they're bringing these issues and these attitudes into the church, and there's no one there to really stop it. There's no one really there to say, this is wrong. And in some cases, they really just didn't think it was a problem. So some of what Paul is trying to do is to actually tell them, in some cases for the first time, no, guys, you can't do that, right? That doesn't fly in this community. But they're coming from a world where that is absolutely standard everyday behavior. So what I want to do over the next few weeks is look at a couple of these issues and some of the particularly seemingly heinous ones. And I guess they are. They're pretty bad. But really try to unpack them for what was actually going on. But then to really ask the important question, which is the question of the title, are we Corinth? Are we actually any different in the modern church? And to look at the attitudes that's going on behind these behaviors, and then to see if we can identify that same attitude within our own congregations or within our own communities. Because the reality is that it's not just that the Corinthians were being Corinthians or that they were being first century people. The problem is they're being humans. The problem is with humanity. The problem is with sin. The problem is with the broken state of us as a race. And so what Paul is trying to deal with is the core issue that is the timeless issue. These attitudes have never changed. The attitude of sin has never changed. Sin has always been sin. It's just that it manifests itself in different ways, different times, different cultures, and what one person thinks is sin, another person thinks is fine. But what it all boils down to is an attitude towards your community or an attitude towards God, whatever it might be, that's the thing that hasn't changed. And so what I want to try to do is to show something of a comparison. Let's look at what the Corinthians were doing and ask the question of ourselves, are we still doing the same thing? Sure, we might not be manifesting it in a particular behavior like sleeping with a stepmother, at least I hope not, but what was going on behind that was causing that to happen in the first place? Well, that's what we sort of want to deal with, hopefully, in these next few weeks. So as I've indicated, I want to look at this issue of a man in a relationship with his stepmother. Now, it actually corresponds to another verse. Now, you might be aware of this, if you're familiar with your Bibles, you might be aware of this situation going on in Corinth. And certainly it's an unusual one. It comes from 1 Corinthians 5, where a man is in a relationship with his stepmother. And it's probably not one that you've taught in your Bible study groups and probably never preached from it, because it's a pretty disturbing situation that's going on. And what makes it even more troubling is this one line that Paul has in the passage, which is his response to the situation, the way that he wants the church to deal with this particular offender. And his response is to say, hand this person over to Satan. Now, that's probably the part that has stood out to you. That's probably the part that's actually given you the most offense. I remember a couple of times where I've heard people just go, how on earth could the Bible teach that? How could Paul possibly say that? Hand a person over to Satan. Who are we to judge a person? How can we send a person to hell? Or however that's been interpreted, it's a really troubling passage. And so that tends to be what we focus on. That's the sort of the go-to. But what we maybe miss in the midst of that is what is actually going on that's caused Paul to say that in the first place. And what that is this man who is in this relationship with his stepmother. So I want to look at that situation, but I also want to, within that, revisit this command, this hand this person over to Satan, and particularly ask the question, do we still do that today? To hand a person over to Satan, one, what does that look like? How do you actually do that? Do the gates of hell open up and we sort of kick this person out of church into hell? Who's even responsible for that sort of ministry? If I'm signing up to be an usher at my church, I'm hoping that that's not part of my role, which is the handing the person over to Satan or however that might look. So I want to sort of look at that as well within the context of the situation that's going on and just see if we can sort of bring some light and again, see if there's anything we can draw out of that for our own context today. All right, so let's look at the passage itself. 1 Corinthians 5:1, it says, "It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality amongst you, and of a kind that even pagans do not tolerate. A man is sleeping with his father's wife." Now, I'm reading from the NIV, and what it specifically says there is a man is sleeping with his father's wife. Now, that is more of a transliteration, not a transliteration, it's more of an interpretation of what is actually going on in the Greek. Because what the Greek literally says is closer to what we find in the ESV, which is for a man has his father's wife. Now, if you're not watching the video, I'm, quote unquote, has. A man is having his father's wife. It's a euphemism. It's Paul's way of saying sex without saying sex. So Paul is describing this man in a sexual relationship, and he's talking about it in the present tense, as in this man is having his father's wife. In other words, it's an ongoing thing. It's not just like a one-off, this happened a couple of months ago and we'll never do it again. No, this is an intentional, long-term, or however long it's been going on for, relationship between a son and his father's bride. Now, we say a stepmother because Paul is very specific about this. He talks about it being a father's wife. Now, if he wanted to say a mother, he would say a mother. Right, he would be talking about a biological mother. He would specify that, but he specifies the fact that this is a father's wife. In other words, this is the stepmother. Now, the circumstances for this would be very, very common in the ancient world. If you remember that when a couple are married, it's always going to be between a man in his mid-20s and a girl who's gone through puberty, so between 13 and 15. So already there's about a 10-year age gap between the husband and the wife. And it's very, very common for women to die in childbirth. It's very, very common for fathers to remarry, having lost their first wife. That's a standard sort of thing that happens. What it also means is that when a son is born, when children are born in the family, by the time the mother might die, those children are getting a little bit older. They're maybe getting into their teen years. And it also means that when a father or when a man remarries, he's not going to be marrying a woman the same age as what his previous wife was. So imagine, a 25-year-old marries a 15-year-old, 10 years down the track, he's 35, she's 25, and so she dies and he goes and remarries another 25-year-old woman. That's not going to happen because all the 25-year-old women are married, right? You don't really get many single women. So you're not going to find that situation. And what he's going to be looking for is a wife who is still a virgin. He's going to be looking for a replacement for his wife who can be a noble woman, not some other man's previous wife. I know this sounds all very chauvinistic and all very patriarchal. I get all of that. It's the first century. All right, we've just got to deal with that. So he's going to marry somebody who was, around the age of 15, right? He's going to be marrying somebody who is single or who's that age because those are the only girls that are single. So that's a pretty standard thing. In fact, we've got one example of this. Pliny, who I mentioned before. Pliny was, I think he was up to about his third or fourth wife because he keeps losing his wives. And he's pushing into his 50s or even to his 60s. And we find this letter that he's written to his new mother-in-law about his fantastic new bride he's writing just to praise this woman for what a great daughter she's raised. And this girl's 11. Now, that should make you cringe. It should make your skin crawl. But that's how it was. In fact, we actually have the tomb of this young girl. She died not long after that, and you can go to Rome and actually see this young girl's tomb. It's really quite extraordinary. But that's really normal. You see that happening all the time. What that then means is that you've got this father who's brought this young girl into the house, and you've got a son who's still living with the father, and she's closer to the age of the son. And so, whatever, play out the situation. You can imagine how this could come about. You could imagine how a relationship might come about. Again, we can only speculate. We've only got like 3 words in the Greek to build this from. But given what we know about the culture, you can imagine that this is maybe somehow of how the circumstances came into being. Now, the fact that only the man doing it gets mentioned would suggest that he's the only part of the community. If the father was part of the community, Paul would address the father. If the woman was part of the community, he would also address her. He doesn't. He only addresses this man who's doing this. And so that would suggest that he's a part of this church community. So the question that raises then is, who is this guy? Like, why is this even happening in the first place? Well, we'll come to that question, but let's just look a bit more closely then at the situation itself. Now, you'll say, all right, it's bad. It's a morally bad situation, and it's in an inappropriate situation, but not much more than that. It's a moral issue, not much more. The problem was in that context was that actually, no, this was a legal issue. From whatever cultural perspective you looked at this was illegal. Now, the Jewish culture, of course, rapidly forbid this kind of behavior. No question. We see this in Leviticus 18. It says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness." And the same law applies in Leviticus 20:11. If a man lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Now, it's interesting. Now, of course, this is Roman Corinth, right? They live by Roman law. They're not interested in Jewish law. Those laws can apply to the Christian context, but they're certainly not legally binding laws. Nevertheless, they do play an important part in Paul's understanding of how this community should be formed. They haven't got a New Testament yet, and so a lot of the moral, particularly around issues of sexual immorality, when Paul comes along, he doesn't change any of that. Whatever the Old Testament says about sexual immorality carries through 100% into the New Testament without any change. So this is condemned in the Old Testament. It's absolutely going to be condemned in the New Testament as well. But what's really interesting is that the way that or how the problem is described. So it says, you will not lay with your father's wife because you've uncovered your father's nakedness. In other words, it's not just that it's an adulterous situation. It's actually a direct challenge, or it's a direct attack on the integrity of the father, or of the integrity of the household. Remembering that the father is the head, he's the boss, he's the CEO of an ancient family, and he has actually legal responsibility, as legal prerogative over his family members, to the extent that he can kill his children if they are bringing shame on the family. He has total legal authority over that. And so he's the boss, right? He's like the emperor in this mini empire, which is called the family. And he requires honor. He deserves honor. That you honor him, you lift him up, because in doing that, well, that's puts him in his rightful position, but it also maintains the honor of the family. So if you attack him, if you even say something disparaging about him in public, that can bring on you not just his wrath, but the scorn of the community. How dare you speak about your father? You can imagine that the worst crime, the worst kind of murder you can have in the Roman world is patricide. It's the killing of a father. That's as bad as it could possibly get. So the father is a protected species. You don't attack the father. And what greater, more disgraceful way to challenge or to discredit the honor of your father than to sleep with his wife, right? To sleep with your stepmother. It is a direct attack on the family itself. It's a direct attack on him, on his position, on his integrity. All of those things are coming under attack because of what you're doing here, particularly as a family member. I mean, it's bad enough in this world that you would go and sleep with another man's wife, but to your father's wife, there's a line, and then you've gone beyond that line. In fact, you can't even see the line anymore. Like it's way back in the distance. So that's the real challenge that's been presented here. It's the attack on the father. And so naturally in the Jewish context, you're going to find that, but especially in the Roman context, you're going to find the same thing. And so we actually find a whole series of laws specifically around the definition of stepmothers and also what you can't do with them, which is basically, well, you can't do anything with them. That's the point. So we get this longer one written by Augustus. It says that I cannot marry a woman with whom my father lived in concubinage, for she occupies to some extent the position of a stepmother. Certain authorities understand a stepmother to be the wife of the father. An adopted son cannot marry the widow of his natural or adoptive father. Where his father has had several wives, he cannot marry any of them. Augustus decided that I cannot marry a woman whose mother has been betrothed to me, for she occupied to the position of my mother-in-law. So what this law is trying to do is to unpack the different ways in which a stepmother or a mother-in-law can be defined, and basically to say that all of it is off limits. You cannot go anywhere near it, even if it's a woman who has left your father. She's no longer even married to your father. She's off doing something else. She still has been his wife, and so as a result of that, she's off limits, right? You can't even go anywhere near that because basically she's been like a mother to you. So all of that is very clear. And the reason actually behind these laws, what Augustus did, if you remember, Augustus is the first sort of formal emperor. It was under Augustus that Jesus was born. So he's sort of there at what becomes the beginning of this modern era, this AD era. What he was trying to do was to bring about some reform in Rome. What had been happening in Rome was that a lot of the elite women were becoming much wealthier, and they were kind of going off and doing their own thing. The traditional view in the Roman world was that a woman is created to be a wife, to bear children, to clean the house, and to keep silent. That's what her role is, and so long as she fulfills that role, she's an honorable woman. Now, she has to do that because, well, she doesn't have a job. She can't work because she's always pregnant. She's always having children. So it's impossible for her to build a life apart from her husband or her father. And so she needs a husband. And so that's going to be naturally how she functions, she operates. She's stuck with her husband for good or ill because she has no other means of support. But what was starting to happen was that you're getting very, very wealthy Roman families, extraordinarily wealthy families. And the daughters of these families were starting life with incredible wealth. They don't need husbands because they're independently wealthy. They don't need to find a husband who's going to support them once their father dies. They've got their own money. So what these women are doing is they're saying, well, stuff the traditions. We're going to go and do our own thing because we can. Right? We've got our own money, we've got our own independence, and so we're going to make the most of it. Now, they might still get married because they still can't hold political positions. Women can't hold any sort of political office, but the honor that comes along with that can still be gained by being married to a senator, for example. If you're married to a high-status Roman government official or a senator, that sort of thing, you get the honor of being the wife of that person. So all of that is still relevant, and that's still going to boost your status as a woman. But you don't need your husband, right? He's sort of there to sort of boost you up in the same way that you're kind of there to boost him up. It's all, you can imagine that sort of high status, high rolling kind of marriage. Well, she's going to be very independent, and what that is going to enable her to do, or what that's going to embolden her to do, is to take control of her sexuality. Right? She's not going to be confined to just having sex with her husband for the purposes of making babies. And if she doesn't do that, she's going to be out on her backside and she's going to die in the streets. She has that power over her husband that she can do what she wants. And so this is starting to become a problem in Rome, particularly amongst the elite families, because all of those elite families are the traditional families of Rome. They're the families that go all the way back to the early days of the Roman world. And what Augustus is trying to do is to preserve those pure bloodlines, that blue blood of the Roman aristocracy. He's trying to preserve that. And what is going to contaminate that, or particularly for the boys that have been born into these families, what can contaminate that is that we don't know who the father is. So if a man can go and sleep with whoever he wants, that's fine. We've done a whole series on that previously. But for a woman, it's a very different thing to sleep around. She can't do that because, well, if she does, she might get pregnant to someone who's not a husband. We don't know who this baby is. And so we're mixing the bloodlines and it's all sort of becoming a bit of a mess. So what he was trying to do was to encourage these marriages to be faithful. He's trying to change laws and make very strict laws around adultery. Other things like having babies. Women are refusing to have babies. They're having abortions, or they're just simply not getting pregnant. And the reason for that is that they want to maintain their figures, or they just don't want to have children. And so they're not having children. But that, of course, what that means is that these blue-blooded families are not reproducing. And so what he's encouraging them to do is to have more children. So there's a whole series of reforms that Augustus brings in order to try to curb this this sort of train wreck that's going on amongst the elite families. And within these laws, he sort of introduces also these laws around sleeping with a stepmother, amongst other things. Again, because it's not a moral issue. It's not that, oh, that's just really gross, don't do that. It's because it's an attack on the dignity of the father. It's an attack on the dignity of the family. So this is a legal issue. And so what this man in Corinth is doing in sleeping with his stepmother is a legal issue, not just a moral issue, but actually a legal issue. And in a city like Roman Corinth, it's a Roman city first and foremost, those laws are going to matter. This is something this is a city that's going to be aware of that. And so when we read verse 1 again, we get this this sort of idea, or this sort of serious, the severity of it coming through in what Paul says. This is actually reported there's sexual immorality amongst you, and of a kind that even pagans do not tolerate. Now, we could read that and go, oh, this is so immoral that even these pretty immoral Romans, even they go, dude, that's too far. Again, it's nothing to do with morality. It's all to do with law. The pagans don't tolerate this. In fact, they condemn it legally because it's a legal issue. So that's what Paul's doing. And what it would indicate too is that he's in an ongoing relationship with this woman, which would suggest that actually the father is still alive. It's one thing if he was to have a relationship with this woman after the father died. That would be bad, but no one's really going to make much of a deal about it. Look, we don't tolerate it. Like, it's illegal. If someone wants to press charges, sure, we'll deal with it, but otherwise we'll let it slide. If the father is still alive, which this seems to suggest is going on, now we're in a completely different category. Now it's actually not just incest, it's actually adultery as well. And so this is the double whammy. In fact, what is expected to happen in this situation is that the father, whenever a husband finds out that there's an adulterous situation going on, it's his job to exile his wife to an island, to send her off in exile to some remote island, to punish her himself, in order to maintain his own honor, in order to maintain his own dignity as a man. And so if the father in Corinth is still alive, which it would seem to suggest that he is, that's what he's expected to do. Now, Paul can't command him to do that because, again, this guy doesn't seem to be part of the community. That it's not like any prerogative that Paul has here. But what we're going to find out is that he expects the Corinthians to at least do something about it. Now, I've painted a pretty dire legal situation here. And at its worst, what we're dealing with is criminal sexuality. We're dealing with sexuality that, if found out, is going to bring punishment to the person who's done it. But as an extension of that, bring punishment or threat to the community that seemed to enable it. The Romans weren't fussy about that stuff. If you're aware of this, if you're supporting this, you're going to get punished along with it. You are complicit in this. And so even to bring a modern example of this, you think about criminal sexuality. I mean, the most obvious example would be something like pedophilia. It's one thing for that to be happening, and if the police were to find that person, they would naturally bring charges against them. But if they were to then find out that the church community that this person was part of knew about it and didn't do anything about it, didn't say anything about it, how do you think the police are going to respond? How do you think the authorities are going to respond in that situation? They're going to go, oh, well, you didn't know any better, so it's cool. We won't worry about it. No. You're going down with them, right? Your church, your community is going down with this person because you harbored this in the first place. So everybody is now complicit in this at its most extreme. If the Roman authorities were to bring this man to trial, this would be a problem, not just for the man, but also for the church that's going along with it. So if you're looking ahead to hand this person over to Satan, you can maybe get a sense of maybe where this is going. But what we need, the reality of the situation would be maybe not so severe. The reality would be that those laws that I just described would really just apply in Rome. The blue-blooded aristocratic families aren't living in a place like Corinth. Those laws are really only concerned with them. At the end of the day, the upper classes cared nothing for the lower classes. If there was a low-status man who was sleeping with his father's wife, no one would even bat an eyelid of that. If you're just a low-status poor person, we don't care about that because you're not threatening the broader Roman society. You're not threatening the overall dignity of Rome. An elite person can do that. Is that sort of threat? A low status person? Absolutely not. And that just becomes a family matter. If at a lower status, if it's just, if the father wants to do something about it, he's got legal prerogative to do that, but that's up to him. And it's only his honor that is at stake here. So there's already a distinction within a place like Rome. When you come out to a place like Corinth, you're going to find that same lack of concern. There's not going to be as much concern, again, as what you would find in an elite Roman family. And so even though this is happening, even though it is technically illegal, you're going to find less of a threat. You're going to find less of a potentially legal consequence that's going to come from this. So that would give at least an explanation for why this is happening, and it's happening publicly. This is the thing to remember too. This isn't happening in secret. Paul's over in Ephesus when he's writing this, and he's heard about it from all the way over in Ephesus, right? This isn't something that was going on in secret. It's happening publicly. Everybody knows about this, and Paul's heard about it in Ephesus. So this isn't private, right? This is public knowledge, and they wouldn't be so bold about it being known publicly if there was any really major legal concern. So we have to sort of maybe eliminate that as the primary concern of what's going on. And keeping in mind as well that the emperors themselves were publicly guilty of the same thing. I mean, the emperor right at this particular time was the Emperor Claudius. Now, the Emperor Claudius was married to his niece, his actual niece, his blood niece. And in fact, it was so, I mean, that is incest. I mean, that's not just legally defined incest, that's actual proper incest. And in order for that to happen, in order for that to even become legal, because this was his wife, this was his public wife. Everybody knew that this was his niece at the same time. So this is Agrippina, who's also the mother of Nero, who becomes the next emperor. The way that was actually made legal was that they changed the laws to say incest is bad in all circumstances except when it comes to your niece. That's okay. They changed the laws to accommodate this incestuous relationship that Claudius had. Now, the emperor just before him was the Emperor Caligula, who was married to his sister. So incest was something that was going on at the highest levels. And so whatever the laws were saying in Rome, the enforceability of that in a place like Corinth is pretty minimal. In fact, when you look at ancient comedies, think about modern sitcoms, and a modern sitcom is just it's a bit of a mockery of the society. That's what makes it funny. It takes something in society and it makes a joke out of it. Comedy has always been that way. Ancient Roman comedy was just the same, and one of the sort of stock characters, one of the stock stories you find in ancient comedy is this situation where a father and a son are competing for the same girl. And that's the whole story. The story is the father and son competing for this girl. And usually the way the comedy works out is that the son gets the girl, which is the funny part because that's never going to happen. It's if a father and a son are competing, the fact that the son is competing against the father in the first place is what is so socially disgraceful. And so you make it funny by giving the son the girl. So that's a standard thing. People are watching this in the theaters. This is like, sitcoms of the ancient world. So as a general idea, yes, it's illegal. Yes, it's intolerable as far as the Romans, and certainly as far as the Jews are concerned, absolutely intolerable. It's bad whichever way you look at it, and this is what is going on in Corinth. This is a really serious matter. Whether it's going to be legally prosecuted is another issue, but it's still nobody in any part of that world will look at this and say, nothing to see here, all of this is perfectly fine. But then in verse 2, Paul actually identifies the real problem that he has with this. It's not even the fact that this man is doing it in the first place. That's the only mention he makes of the person. He doesn't even talk about, extensive detail about who this person is. His shock is actually with the church that's tolerated it in the first place. He says in verse 2, and you're proud, literally puffed up with pride. You are so proud and boastful as a church while this is all still happening. Now, there's a bit of a conundrum, or there's a bit of a an either or going on in the understanding of this verse. How are they proud? Like, in what way are they demonstrating pride as a church in the midst of this happening? And so there's been a couple of probably very plausible suggestions as to what's going on. In one case, in one suggestion, it could be that the man who's doing this is actually a patron of the church. Now, remembering that you don't have a church building that everybody attends, you meet in people's houses. Someone owns that house, and the person who owns that house is going to be a wealthy, homeowner, and they're going to allow you to meet in their house. Now, in some cases, they're not even Christians, right? In some cases, they just want the honor of having this group come and meet in their place. But often what would be the case would be that a household or a family would come to the faith, and the father would then open up the house for the rest of the church to meet in. And so the church was reliant on these sorts of people. They needed these wealthy benefactors in order to have a church in the first place. Otherwise, they're literally meeting out on the street. So these people are important, and we need to honor them in the same way that you would honor anybody in a patron-client society like the ancient world, where a patron gives a client a gift and what they get in return is honor. So this is how this world works. In this case, what the pride could be is pride in their patron. Right? They're still boasting about this man who is their patron because he's their patron. Yes, we're aware of what he's doing, but at the same time, we need to be very careful about how we speak about him and certainly not try to publicly shame him because he's a patron. And that is absolutely the worst possible thing you can do, is to shame a patron. That is just, it's as bad as it can possibly get in this sort of honor-shame society. So you don't do that. And that's not something these Corinthians are ready to do. And so in spite of what this person is doing, nevertheless, they're still honoring him as a patron. And Paul says, how on earth is that even possible that you could be doing this, that you prioritize his honor over the morality of your community? This is absolutely shocking. Now, a second option of this pride could be that they're still proud of their spiritual status. They're still boasting about how incredibly spiritual and holy they are in spite of this thing going on. They've got this man who's doing this publicly, and they're saying, yep, nothing to see here. Look how spiritual we are. And that is just par for the course in who we are as a church. So that's a very likely, in fact, that's probably absolutely what is going on. The Corinthians are absolutely boasting and proud about what their perceived spiritual status is, despite what's going on. And very likely it could be that this is a high status man because, they wouldn't probably tolerate it otherwise. They're putting up with this guy because of probably his status within the community. So it probably is a bit of a both hand that's happening here. And Paul, again, is absolutely horrified that they would prioritize this man's honor, and they would even probably not even see it as a problem in the first place. This is what is really getting under his skin here. Like, who are you? How did it get to this? How do you not see that this is a problem? I mean, that's a problem with you. It's bad enough that this is happening in the first place, that this is a person even in your community, but the fact that you don't even see it as a problem, wow. again, how did we get to this place? And so Paul's shocked, naturally, and he responds by saying, shouldn't you rather have gone into mourning and have put out of your fellowship the man who has been doing this? So legal or not, in Paul's mind, this is intolerable. You can't do this. This doesn't fit. It's not just that it's a legal problem, but it's also a moral issue, and that goes all the way back to Leviticus. We cannot tolerate this. The fact that you're tolerating it is absolutely shocking to me. Why on earth have you not got rid of this person? I cannot wrap my head around this, that you would think that this is okay and that you would think that this is tolerable to the point where you would still honor this person as somebody to look up to, somebody who is worthy of emulation. This again, I can't. The shock is just palpable coming through Paul's pen here. So then he says in verse 3, "For my part, even though I am not physically present, I am with you in spirit. As one who is present with you in this way, I have already passed judgment in the name of our Lord Jesus on the one who has been doing this." Now, here's where we start to get into some difficult territory, this sort of judgy sort of language. Who's Paul to sit there and condemn this person? Isn't God the only person who can judge? What about grace? Look, the reality of all of these ancient societies or all of these ancient community groups like the church is that they were responsible to deal with their own members and deal with their own standards. Every single group you're part of has a set of rules. It has a set of standards. Wherever you go, whatever group you find yourself in, it's going to have rules. And these are literally rules written in stone. Like if you go to the meeting hall, you're going to see a stone tablet, or you might have a piece of papyrus, and these are the laws you sign up for. If you're part of this group, these are the rules. In the same way that if you walk into a club today, what you're going to see in the foyer are the rules of the club, dress codes or whatever the requirements for membership in that community are. You're going to agree to those before you can become a member. This has always been true. And like today, but certainly in the ancient world, when somebody violates the club's policies or the club's rules, the club is absolutely obligated to deal with that person appropriately. That's true wherever you go, and whatever the extent of the punishment might be. It might be a fine, or it might be right up to the point of remove the person from the group altogether. And the reason why you do that is because you're trying to protect the dignity of the group. We as a group represent a certain thing. We hold to a certain set of values, and so people know when they come to this group, this is what they can expect. These are the values that we uphold. Whatever they might be, whatever the standards are, that's what people know about us. And so if you're coming into this group, you have to abide by those standards. You have to be the sort of person who holds those standards to begin with. And so when you come in, you need to align yourself with that if you want to call yourself a member of this group. Now, think about it. This applies to every community you're part of. Think about the job you're in, right? You go to a workplace, there are rules. If you break those rules, you lose your job. You go to school, there are school rules. I mean, wherever you go, whatever community you're part of, right down to the family, right? A family has standards. And if you violate those, you're going to get punished. Like wherever you find yourself, there's going to be standards. You've got to uphold those standards. And if you don't, then you can't call yourself a member of the group. Right? You excommunicate yourself at that point. If you come in and you intentionally violate the rules of the group, you have already by that cut yourself off from it. You've broken that pledge to that group. It's as simple as that. And so very, very clearly, this person has violated it in the most disgraceful way. I mean, he hasn't just violated Jewish law, Jewish moral codes around sexual immorality. He's broken Roman law. You don't get any worse than that. This person is not an upstanding member of this community. In fact, worse than that, this person is actively working against the values of the group. And so the judgment that Paul's passed on this man is guilty. He's guilty of breaking the rules of the Christian community. It's as simple as that. And so this judgment is absolutely in keeping with what you would expect in any group, within any sort of community that has a set of standards that expects its members to uphold. So he says, verse 4, "So when you are assembled and I'm with you in spirit, and the power of our Lord Jesus is present, hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord." So here's the troubling verse. Hand this person over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. Who are we to condemn a people? Who are we to condemn a person to hell? Is that what Paul's saying here? Hand a person over to Satan. Who are we to try to be God? What about grace? What about, mercy? And well, we've already established that grace doesn't apply here, right? God might forgive this person, but right now this person is not a good member of the community and this person needs to be removed. But let's just take a step back for a second and just think about, what is the community of Christ trying to represent? Well, obviously it's Jesus, right? The values and the person of Jesus are what this community is meant to embody. Simple. So this community is the embodiment of Christ. It is the expression of Christ on earth. And so naturally it not just upholds the values of Jesus, but if you want to put it into, I guess, colloquial terms, it's Team Jesus, right? You're on Team Jesus. You sign up for that team, you put on the uniform, you play the game according to the rules, you align yourself with the values of the team. That's what you're part of, right? You play as a team member on Team Jesus. That should be obvious, right? I mean, if you want to put the church into the most simplistic terms, that's what we are. We're on Team Jesus. Now, keeping it very simple, there's a basic dichotomy here. If you're not on Team Jesus, then you're outside of Team Jesus, and there's only one other team, right? If there is a Team Jesus, there can only be one other team, and that is Team Satan. There's just no other way to put it. Now, whatever Satan you want to believe about Satan, or however you want to describe him, Satan just means the enemy. Satan means the opposer. Satan is the thing that we stand against, or the thing that we're not. So if you are not on Team Jesus by default, not even that you're an evil, terrible person, some Satan worshipping 666 tattooed across your chest, like, it's just that you're not on Team Jesus. And if you're not on Team Jesus, then clearly you're on Team Satan. Just by simple default. If you're not wearing the uniform of one team, you're wearing it of the other team. That's just how it is. So let's look at this man. What is this man doing? He's actively pursuing a form of sexual immorality that is not just violating the Christian/Jewish moral sexual code, but it's illegal. And if it plays out to the full legal extent, could bring the whole community under severe legal scrutiny. So you have to ask the simple question. Is this person really on Team Jesus? I mean, really, can this person honestly say, can anybody honestly say that this person is a legitimate card-carrying, upholding member of the Christian community? Surely not. Absolutely not. This person cannot possibly be that. Now, again, it's not to say that they're wickedly evil and a particularly egregiously terrible person. There's probably plenty of other people in Corinth who are doing exactly the same thing. But you cannot be part of this team and actively do that and say that you're actually on this team. It doesn't work that way. And so who this person is, or the team that this person is on, is clearly Team Satan, right? There's just no other way to assess this. This person is on Team Satan. And so Paul says, hand this person over to Satan. What's he saying? Well, just send him back to his own team. He's pretending to play in your team. He doesn't belong here. He's not part of this team. Send him back to his own team. Just simply acknowledge who the guy actually is and stop pretending that he's playing on your team. It's that simple. So what would this look like? How would this actually outwork itself? Well, simple. He'd just be excommunicated from the community. He would not be welcome back. Simple. 4, Paul says, the destruction of the flesh. What is Paul hoping for? Well, hopefully he'll come to realize that you can't take grace for granted, right? You can't claim to be part of this team, do all of these things, and then still be on the same team. It doesn't work that way. And so, well, hopefully he'll realize that. Hopefully he'll be restored. But in the meantime, he doesn't belong here, and stop pretending that he does. You've just got to get rid of this guy. So he goes on in verse 6. He says, your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast just so that you may be a new unleavened batch. So here's where the problem really, where the problem really lies for Paul. It's the effect this guy's going to have on the community. It's that he's metaphorically like this leaven that is going to work its way through the whole batch and ruin the whole batch. You've got to get rid of it. That thing is going to fundamentally transform the nature of the bread, or in this case, the nature of the community. You cannot tolerate this. And by tolerating this, even if you don't agree with it, even if you don't like it, the fact that you're tolerating it, the fact that you're still calling this guy a Christian, the fact that you're still saying, oh no, this guy's a great upstanding member of the community, what you're saying is that we hold that value, right? We agree with that. This behavior, because we tolerate it, tells you that we must think it's okay. And so what that is saying to everybody else is that this sort of community is one that harbors illegal behavior. That is a bad look for the whole community in the broader Roman society, because, well, they're going to look as people who harbor criminals. That's not the look you want to get out there. But even more than that, what you're going to say to everybody else in the community is that this is okay. You tolerate this. In fact, you even promote this person. You even honor this person as a high-standing member, as a leader of the community. Well, leading by example, what this person is saying is that this is okay. Others are going to look at that and go, well, if that's okay, then I'll do the same thing. And so what happens is that this attitude, this behavior permeates its way through the community because no one's saying it's wrong. No one is telling anyone to stop. And so you've got to get rid of that. You've got to make it very clear, not just to this person, but to the rest of the community, we don't tolerate that. We have standards, and when those standards are violated, we deal with it, and we deal with it to whatever extent is required. In this case, get this person out of your community. And now there's more to this chapter, but I'll just point to one more little sort of line he has at the end of verse 11. He says, do not even eat with such people. In other words, dissociate from this person at communion. When the church got together, they had communion. When you sat down for communion, what that indicated to everybody else was that you're part of this community. Actually, we'll talk about this next week in the context of meals. But what Paul's saying here is that you can't have this person at your table, because that's telling everybody else outside that this sort of behavior is okay in this community. You can't do it. Got to get rid of this guy. So clearly you can see this guy is... Paul's response here is perfectly standard, perfectly fitting with what this behavior requires. This should have absolutely been par for the course sort of response that the Corinthians should have brought about. For Paul, the shock wasn't just the fact that this guy's doing it in the first place, it's the fact that the Corinthians are tolerating it at all. That's the thing that really is just absolutely blowing his mind in all of this. And so I'm asking sort of the question up front, are we Corinth? What does this look like today? Are we still doing this same sort of thing? Well, I hope specifically that we're not having people in our churches who are publicly sleeping with their stepmother whilst their father is still married to this woman. I really, 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 truly hope that that's not something that's going on in any of our churches. But what about the attitude behind it? What about just the general sin and immorality? Well, it's a pretty simple question. Does your church have sin and immorality? Well, I would like to say yes. I don't want to say yes, but I would have to say it would be, because there's humans in there. Sin, sexual immorality, in whatever form it expresses itself, is a part of the human nature. It's sin. That's what we're being redeemed from. It's going to be part of every community. So absolutely what this guy is doing is particularly egregious, but it's only an extended degree of what is sexual immorality. Sexual immorality, as far as Jesus describes it, is looking at a woman lustfully. Well, we've all, for the men, I guess we could speak, we're all going to be guilty of that to some degree, but what Jesus is saying is that there's no place for any of it. All of it is bad. Whatever degree it is, whether it's sleeping with a stepmother or just looking at a woman lustfully, it's all sexual immorality. It's as simple as that. And so that is always going to be present in every community. But what about the bigger issue of prioritizing a patron? Because that's what this guy is, right? This guy, if we assume, is a patron of the church. Put in modern terms, what this person is your church's biggest giver. Right? This is a person who is bankrolling a major ministry in the church, somebody who is a very wealthy person who is saying, look, I will pay for a whole missions program, but I want something in return, right? I want special privileges, or just the church giving more tolerance to the person who's given a lot more money, because we don't want to lose the money, right? We don't want to lose this person's patronage, and giving preference to that person over against somebody who might just be a bit more of a problematic person. Maybe someone who's not giving as much or not giving at all, somebody who's just a bit more trouble, a bit more hard work, as opposed to this person over here who's a millionaire, who's funding so much of what we do. Well, again, you can imagine how easily it would be that we give even tacit preference to that wealthier person. And I can probably assure you that most churches are guilty of this to some extent or another, right? They're going to work that little bit harder just not to lose that person who is a primary giver of a church that requires, well, money, like all churches do. So again, that attitude, well, that hasn't changed, right? There's going to be that natural deference to a high status person in a community. It's as simple as that. And so what the Corinthians are guilty of is well, that. And so again, are we Corinth? Well, I would have to say yes. Yes, we are, because we still do exactly that kind of behavior. But what about their pride in what they're, despite what they're tolerating, or there's stuff going on that they're aware of that they know is wrong, but they're still boasting about how great they are. They're not even, they're maybe just turning a blind eye to it, or they don't even necessarily think it's a bad thing. Maybe they've just got such a low understanding of what the moral requirement of this community is that they don't even see it as being a problem. Well, again, we're all guilty of that. I mean, if you were to ask 10 people in your church, what are the moral standards required around something like sexual immorality, for example, you're probably going to get 10 different answers because we don't really have any clear standards on what that is. And if we were to be really honest about with everyone within our communities as to what they're doing and what the sort of behaviors that are going on, we'd be probably pretty shocked at what we do tolerate because, well, it's just a reality of who we are as humans, as Christians, and as a community. Or what about the fact that the Corinthians just really don't seem concerned to protect the bigger community? They're more concerned about the individual than they are about the group. This person is an immediate threat who has the potential to completely destroy this community, and they're not doing anything about it because they're not seeing the community. They're more concerned about the individual. And I think if I was to sort of challenge you, if you get offended initially by the hand this person over Satan, oh, what about the individual? What about the poor person who's going to be affected by this? Well, what about the community? Do we ever think about the community? Do we ever think about the impact that this is having on everybody else? This one person can poison the rest of the group. Do we think about the group, or do we just focus in on the individual, particularly if they're a high status person? And I guess overall, as a sort of a repeat of what I just said a moment ago, are we even aware of the boundaries? If someone crosses the line, would we even know? Do we know where the line is? Are we even that clear on what the boundaries of our community are so that when someone does cross it, we can know that they've crossed a line, but even beyond that, would we do anything about it? Would we acknowledge that and deal with that person appropriately? I don't know. I hope your community would, but I would like to say that probably in most cases, it doesn't happen. So I finished by saying this. Are we Corinth? Well, sadly, yes. Yes, in so many ways, yes, we absolutely are, just like the Corinthians, and sadly, really not much has changed. And so that is what it is. We just are. We can't sit here on our high horses and say, oh, well, at least we're not like the Corinthians. Actually, no, we are, and over the next few weeks, we're going to see the many different ways that we are much like the Corinthians. What is an encouragement, though, is that Paul's letter to the Corinthians speaks directly to us. And so what Paul's solution for them is the same solution that we can apply for us today. And so in this way, the Corinthian letter really does become timeless and really does, I hope, become so much more pertinent to who we are as Christians and to who we are as a church community. Well, anyway, I'm aware that was a little bit intense. It's not going to get any easier from here through this series. We're going to look at some pretty challenging passages that are going on and really sort of put a mirror to ourselves in hopefully some self-reflection and realize, hey, you know what, we've got some stuff to deal with as well today. But we'll leave that for the coming weeks. In the meantime, have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you next week.